Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. If you would go ahead and turn in your Bibles back to Habakkuk chapter 2. We will pick up where we left off last week in verse 4, and we will finish out the chapter this morning. I hope you have seen our push this morning in our Psalms and our Scripture readings, the worship of our King, the glory of God, the greatness of our God, the awe that every human being should have of the majesty of God. As we continue to look at this little book, wanted to reiterate the importance of grasping this principle in order to better understand our position as the Church of Christ in an ever-changing world. I hope that it will help us navigate our responses to a country that so desperately needs to see the glory of God and the glory of in the face of Jesus Christ. God is sovereign. We say it. We say it like we know it. But I'm not always sure that we grasp it. I think in this country, I think in this world, I think we see His power way too little. Our anxiety and our worry prove it. We tend to lose sight of His holiness. Much of the world is blind to this grandness, this greatness of who God is. And they live their lives in great folly. And it is this folly that the Bible and the Old Testament prophets especially always address with the judgment of God. I'm going to just start off by reading verse 20, the last verse, so we're very clear on where Habakkuk is going before he responds with his confession of faith and trust in God in chapter 3. But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. The Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. The sins, the failures of this world lie very much in the fact that it sees no necessity to submit their lives to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. The problems of mankind all around the world in our country lie very much in the fact that there is no fear of God. And therefore they are unable to submit to Him or be silent before Him. There is very little understanding of the holiness of God, and because there is so little, there is no recognition of the tragedy of man, that there is no one righteous, no, not one. There is no one that seeks after God. There is no one that seeks to do God's will. Everyone turns to his own way. And like Judges states, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Without this grasp, mankind is lost and in desperate need of rescuing, which brings us to this unfortunate title this morning, the judgment of God. Will you pray with me? Father, we ask for your wisdom and understanding to take effect in our life through your word this morning. We live in a world and in a country that is in desperate need of you. We do not know you as we should. We do not understand your holiness, nor do we understand your judgments. We do not understand the blindness of our hearts. We cannot see past the idols of our hearts. Reveal to us our desperate need for your grace to see and live by faith. It's in Jesus' name we ask. Amen. I know this is everyone's favorite topic for sure, God's judgment. But if the church, we know the Great Commission, we know what we're supposed to do, to reach the lost, to reach the world, if we're going to have an impact in society, we have to have God's impact in us. If God hasn't impacted us, then He's not going to impact the world around us because of us. We have to get this right. Without understanding the necessity of God's judgment, there will never be the understanding of the reason we live by faith. We won't get it. We won't get the gospel clearly until we see God's judgment clearly. I said last week that the church has to look different than the world. Has to. Otherwise, it's lost its purpose in the world, and it's good for nothing. So many churches want to look like the world. We don't look to the world to figure out what we're supposed to look like. We look to God to figure out what we're supposed to look like. When we awake in the morning, what is it that grabs our attention? Is it the boss that is going to be demanding of your job later on? If you work for yourself, is it clients, customers that need your service? Maybe it's your spouse, your family, maybe it's your kids, and they do need your attention. Maybe you're younger, you're going to school. Or maybe it's just the pursuit of entertainment and pleasure for the day. Maybe you have your whole life in front of you. What is it that controls your pursuit? What has your attention? Is it God or is it the world? But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. What has silenced you and has your attention? You see, this word silence and being literally means is being brought to silence. It's silenced. Literally, it means to be hushed. I want to consider two things with this before we look at our whole passage, because it'll give us context as we look at the context at the judgment of God. It is an effect. Being silenced is an effect. It's a caused effect. It's an effect that had to have a cause. And number two, it's lasting. It's not temporary. We may lose sight of this cause at times, but this cause will continue to grab you if you've ever seen it once. It'll continue to grab you, and it'll continue to silence you in order to reprioritize your life. How I live my life. The just will live their life by faith. The one who lives their life by faith has been silenced. The effect is to be silenced, and that cause is the holiness of God, which in its full implication means the world must be judged, because we have all fallen short of the glory of God. So, as we look at the second part of God's response, He will answer this second question that Habakkuk raises. Last week, the first question He answered about the suffering of the righteous. Why do the suffer righteous? The answer is the righteous will live by faith. This week, we're looking at the rest of chapter 2. He answers the question about the success of the wicked. Why do the wicked flourish? By showing that they will eventually reap what they sow. The judgment will also come for them. And so in adding this, what we really see is his further explanation of the just will live by faith. He gives an answer to our faith. You are to believe it. And so the faith will live by the promises of God. He will be content in the fact that God is just, perfectly just, and will rule with perfect justice. The problem with us is His timing and our timing never match up. And so we're always impatient, which reveals our lack of faith. So let's take a look at this section as God delivers promises of judgment. So I want to run down where we've come from so far in Habakkuk. Habakkuk begins this book with a cry to the Lord. How long will the righteous suffer? How long will Judah suffer? How long will God's people suffer? God responds, I'm going to do something amazing, so amazing, you're not even going to believe it. And then proceeds to tell them, hey, you're going into captivity. Habakkuk obviously questions God's plan. Really? Something doesn't add up. Are you sure, God? Is this a joke? Is this a prank? So I'm just going to sit right here in my watchtower and I'm going to wait, and I'm going to wait for your answer, and I expect to be corrected and reproved. And that's where we pick up in chapter 2. The first part of the answer we saw last week. So I'm going to read verse 4. Behold, his soul is puffed up and is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. And so we see the opposite to the person who lives by faith is the man who is proud. And this is the line, the first line of verse 4, that is going to be expounded upon in verse 5, and then will receive their judgments in full and cover every proud person. Verse 5 says, moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol, like death he is never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. If you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls that were recovered 60-some years ago, their manuscripts, which date older than the ones that we have wealth instead of wine. And if you look at it, they can be used interchangeably either way. And it shows the folly of loving the things of this world. It shows the folly of wealth, of pleasure, of wine. And he goes on, he says, those things, they never have enough. If those are the things you want, you're never going to get enough. That's why we have addictions, because once you want something and then you have to have more, and then you have to have more, and it's never enough. And you keep getting more and more and more, and it's never enough. This problem comes for every man. It covers every person in the world. This danger, this sin, to lust after the things of this world, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, John says, these things are passing away. These things are passing away. Why want something that is passing away? Why be so short-sighted? Luke 12, Jesus responds to this question with a parable. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of their possessions. Take care, beware, watch out, don't fall for it. It's a trick. Like he shows in Habakkuk, you're never going to get enough. Never. Never. And he told them this parable. The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Look at the security this guy has in his wealth. Look at the security that he has in his life. But God said to him, you're a fool. This night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. So verse 6, first part of verse 6 says this, shall not all these take up their taunt against him, with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, and then we're going to get into 5 woes through the rest of the chapter. But before we look at these woes, if you're reading through chapter 2, these woes can be kind of tricky to understand who is reading them or who is saying them. But in reality, they are promises of God to the Jews that are going into captivity to speak to their tormentors when there's nothing else to say to the horrible reality of their life, the horrible reality of their condition. They were also to remind the Chaldeans, hey, I know you guys are in control, you're taking us into captivity, but your days are numbered too. God would raise up another country, God will raise up another country to deal with you. And we know that from history, about 70 years later, that's what he did. In these woes, there is a real sense of mourning in these proclamations, rather than a condemnation or curse. Even in the darkest moments, they were to live by faith, believing that God would vindicate them and deal with the wicked more evil than themselves. But listen to this, but also mourn for those who rejected God and would be destroyed. The woe is literally saying how horrible it is to encounter the judgment of God. As a follower of Christ, we are to mourn for those who are under God's wrath. We must have a desire to see them set free. We proclaim it not as an idea of one looking down on someone, but we have sympathy. We have empathy. We don't want to see that person destroyed. To live by faith in a true God means worshiping and honoring Him in both good and bad experiences, one commentator says. Can we not take the good and the bad as well? As Job points out. Finish verse 6, the first woe through verse 8. Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. So we see the ones who are robbing others through force and violence. Those who plunder will be plundered. They will reap what they sow. This phrase in verse 8 we will see repeated in the fourth woe. We'll get to that later. God does not forget evil. He does not forget evil. He does not forget what has been done. The second woe, verse 9 to 11, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life, for the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Similar to the first, but this is more of an extortion, stealing by fraud. In today's world, we would say it's a capitalism that takes advantage of people. The implication from the stone crying out along with the beams, there's nothing that can be hidden. This is the implication. There's nothing that can be hidden from God. God sees all, and He will deal with accordingly. Verse 12, the third woe. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts. Is it not from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. We see the progression of the wicked to robbing and frauding and then eventually building their own towns and nations. I hope we see this as it further expounds from verse 5, talking about the proud and the things that they seek after. They never have enough. They want the things of this world. What does this progress towards? What does this progress towards? There's the promise that evil will not win. Because the future events of God will consume the world, where all the earth will be filled with His glory, as we sung earlier, as the waters cover the sea. Now, Habakkuk, interestingly enough, is quoting another prophet from about 100 years earlier. Isaiah chapter 11, the messianic prophecy of Christ, the righteous branch, reigning in the world. With one difference in the passage, he adds the phrase of the glory, knowledge of the glory of the Lord. You see, it's a promise to the end that the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and everything in this world will be nothing. The sufferings of this world cannot be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us, Romans 8 says. Verse 15, the fourth woe, woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beast that terrified him. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Isaiah 51 says this, thus says your Lord, the Lord, your God, who pleads the cause of His people. Behold, I have taken from your hand the cup of staggering. The bowl of my wrath you shall drink no more, and I will put it into the hands of your tormentors who have said to you, bow down, that we may pass over. Once again, we have the promise of the Lord to deal with Judah's enemy, that they can give to these Chaldeans to make sure that they're aware that their God is in control, that their God oversees all this, and He will take away their judgment and expose it and respond with shame. Verse 18, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies, for its maker trusts his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath in it at all. What has your attention? What do you worship? God systematically deals with the Chaldeans who are punishing Judah, God's people who are not obeying God. He uses them for a time, but then hey, everything you're doing that I'm allowing you to do, it's going to be punished. Your lack of knowledge of who God is, your lack of knowledge of the glory of God will be dealt with. What has your attention? What do you worship? God created us to worship Him. Now, in the fallen world, in a cursed world, we're still a people designed to worship. The problem is we don't worship who we should. Our country, our world. As John Piper liked to say, missions exist because worship doesn't. The world does not worship the Lord the way they should, and that's why the church is here. That's why we're here. What do you value in life? And a good way to know that is when it's taken away, there's a problem. We don't like it. That's a good way to know what we value and what we worship. Is it safety? Is it financial security? Is it health? Is it freedom? What is it? But what do we value? What do we worship? Is it our hope? Is it our goal? Is it our desire that the glory of the Lord fill the earth? Because that's the promise of the Old Testament prophets. That's where we see in Revelation as all things moving towards. God is a jealous God. And He will not allow worship that He rightfully deserves to go unnoticed and to go unpunished. He will not allow it forever. We see His patience now, but it will not go on forever. But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. So we have gotten to where we started. Some consider this to be a part of the last woe, the fifth woe, which I think it is. But it's also a summary of all the woes together. Listen, to show the foolishness of the proud, to show the folly of those that are so full of pride that when they wake up, their life is all about themselves. It's a summary to show the foolishness of lovers of self, lovers of pleasure, instead of lovers of God. And more importantly, this last verse here is the closing statement to Habakkuk's questioning. Remember, he has literally been hushed. God, in essence, has said, this conversation is over. It is time for you to live by faith. It's time to acknowledge God in His holy temple. It's time to acknowledge God as He sits high above the heavens. That's right, His heavens. He is Lord over creation, all creation, His creation. He reigns in perfect justice. The whole earth will be filled with His glory. So, as we consider how God answered Habakkuk and his cries for Judah, how does this deal with me? How does this deal with the church in America, our community, our political climate, the division and strife? How are we to reach people with the good news of the gospel? How are we to fulfill the Great Commission? We're going to take a look at three passages and consider 3 points, main points out of these. There's a lot of points out of these, and I really encourage you to take the time to go through these passages later on, to explore them, to read them, to get to know them. The first one, America has been given over. I have that in quotes, given over, because it's from Romans 1, and is under God's wrath. Number 2, destroy your idols or be destroyed. And number 3, behold your God and live by faith. Let's turn to Romans 1, verse 16. Should be familiar with this verse. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And then we have this verse, which is quoting Habakkuk 2:4. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Now, this passage is kind of paralleling Habakkuk 2, because you have on one hand the gospel, you have on one hand the righteousness of God, you have on one hand difficulty but that difficulty should result for the just who live by faith. And then in verse 18, he flips it over, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to them, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So you see what? Fools that turn their back on the Creator to worship the creation. Yet this is what we're following in Habakkuk 2. These are all the woes that are being dished out, all the pursuits of wine and wealth and pleasure, and the judgment that they received. You may have caught that America has been given over. How do I know that? Because what we read in the rest of Romans 1 is a description of what's going on in America. Therefore, how did God respond to this? Therefore, what did he do? He gave them up to what? The lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and served the creation rather than God, who is the only one worthy of praise. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. The women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, even after all this, this is the judgment of God that's proclaimed on America. Even after all this, he went one step further. God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. That word literally means is they portray themselves to be something that they're not. And we have this, the whole transgender and LGBTQ and all this. America is under judgment. America is under the wrath of God, whether we see it or not. He's given this country up. Why? Because we love his creation over the Creator. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetous, malice. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. How do I know that America is under God's wrath? Because what we just read is what we see. So we go back to verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, which is the power of God to save. The righteous will live by faith. The righteous will live by faith. Not ashamed of the gospel. The second place, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Verse 12 through 19. How do we see the glory of God clearly? How are we not ashamed of the gospel? How do we make sure that we are not among those that God gives up to their lusts? We destroy our idols. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his rule, and his statutes, which I commanded you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God. Now in Deuteronomy, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. We could say all those things to the church today, the rest of them. Do you have a house to live in? Do you have clothes to wear? Do you have food to eat? Do you have a way to live and live comfortably? And the warning is, have you forgotten the Lord your God? To the Jews, they forgot. They brought them out of Egypt. They're so focused on their life and all the things that they have, they didn't have time for God. They didn't have time to worship him and bring glory to him. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He gives you power to get wealth, that He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you will perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. America is one of those nations that has turned its back on the Lord and pursues everything but God. What's the answer? Exodus 14. Behold your God and live by faith. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we have said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians, for would it have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness? Do you see their complaints? They didn't think God would see it through. Has God ever not seen anything through? Ever? Anybody? Has He ever not seen anything through? Do you believe that? Moses said, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. For the Egyptians who you see today, you shall never see again. For the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. The Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Go forward. Believe. Walk in faith. Stop complaining. Stop grumbling. Behold the glory of God and believe Him. We saw last week in Hebrews the reference also to Habakkuk 2:4 that the just will live by faith. We are not those who shrink back and are destroyed, but those who live by faith and preserve their souls. For He is coming in a little while, and He will not delay. It is coming. He's not trying to get around to it. He doesn't have things holding Him back. There's nothing in His way. He's going to do it precisely the time that He wants to do it. Be silent before Him. He is coming and will not delay. Are you ready? Be silent before Him and behold Him as He is. He reigns above all. There is no one like Him. There is no one who can stand against Him. If God is for us, who can be against us? Behold our God and live. Behold his glory and believe. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, we see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. It is he who sits enthroned above, reigning in power and in glory. Trust him today for the salvation of your soul.